on From Populism to Fascism, Intellectual Responsibilities in Times of Democratic Backsliding. My name is Selçuk Gültaşlı, and it's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the European Center for Populism Studies. This panel brings together distinguished voices to explore one of the most pressing questions of our time: how democratic backsliding risks reshaping our societies, how authoritarian tendencies may transform into fascism, and what strategies of resilience can help safeguard liberal democracy for the future. As part of our commitment to knowledge dissemination, ECPS will prepare a detailed panel report and share the video recording of this discussion on your website and YouTube channel. These resources are meant to serve as valuable references for scholars, policymakers, and all those concerned with the challenges posed by populist and authoritarian politics worldwide. Without further delay, I am pleased to hand the floor over to Professor Cengiz Aktar, who will moderate this timely and crucial gathering. Professor Aktar is an adjunct professor of political science at the University of Athens, Greece. He is a former director at the United Nations, specializing in asylum policies. He is known to be one of the leading advocates of Turkey's integration into the EU. He was the chair of the European Studies at Bahçeşehir University, Istanbul. Professor Aktar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Selçuk. Greetings to all, and welcome again to this third meeting of this fall session of the European Center for Populism Studies. I noticed in the bio of the center, and I quote, the international rise of populism, it says, can lead to democratic decay and authoritarianism around the world and endangers global peace, security, and stability. It continues by saying that populist movements, I still quote, tendencies subtly pave the way for exclusionary authoritarianism under various ideological and political disguises, and thus undermine democratic governance. Populism, I still quote the bio of the center, paired with authoritarianism has the potential to undermine even the most established liberal Western democracies in Europe and North America and the USA, of course. Well, here we are. And today we will hear 5 distinguished speakers who extensively worked on the topic, and they will explore responsibilities of those who still believe in democratic values, the way out of this disastrous trend. Disastrous, why? Well, as long as populist leaders and their movements are far from being isolated. These are not isolated dictators. Quite to the contrary, they have ever larger audiences who are happy with the populist narrative's content. You know, in other words, populism vendors, and there are many nowadays, and we have listened to one of them for 56 minutes yesterday in New York, have masses of people ready to buy their merchandise. And who say masses support points, in my opinion, in Arendtian terms, at the conditio sine qua non of fascist governance. So with that, allow me to give the floor to our first speaker, Professor Berezin from Cornell. Please note her latest article, Does the Fascism Debate Matter for Understanding the 2024 American Politics? And by the way, I won't expand on speakers' large bios in order to save time. You can easily find them on the web. Well, Madame, you have the floor for 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. I wanted to thank Professor Gustafsson for inviting me to join this discussion with distinguished colleagues. I'm going to read and I'm going to speak fast, and I'm going over a lot of territory, so bear with me. From Populism to Fascism, Intellectual Responsibilities. This title disturbed me somewhat because I have been thinking intensely, as many of my colleagues, and I'm sure you are also, about what can be done in the United States, as it seems since November 2024 that a high-speed wrecking ball has been trashing our democracy. So much, I'm not even sure we can think about democracy anymore, but that's an open question. And surely the polite academic term backsliding is too weak to use in the American case now. Nonetheless, democratic backsliding in its various authoritarian forms is a global phenomenon that demands a response in the academy and beyond. But threats to democracy are a matter of degree. They vary depending on national context, and the struggle to overcome these threats depends on specific political histories. In 15 minutes, I can only make the most general comments. In looking through my computer files, I realized that it was less than a year ago, on November 14th, 2024, that I was invited here to speak with other distinguished colleagues on the topic, what do the US election results tell us about the global trajectory of populism? And I chose my title today, Locating the Fight of Strategic Engagement in the United States, to accommodate the topic and to highlight differences between Europe and America in this moment. But in fact, in looking over my comments from last year, I'm going to put more of the emphasis on how things have changed from that original set of comments that I made. So let me just quickly Europe, because I did, and a lot of people, half the panel is European. In 2017, after Donald Trump was inaugurated, I wrote an essay that was picked up in multiple media that was entitled, "Trump is not a European-style populist, and that is our problem." And the argument was basically that there was a kind of predictability to the success of the nationalist populist right in Europe. And at that point, I was looking mainly at Marine Le Pen in France. And since 2017, there has been a wave of party after party, as you all know, right-wing parties, if not always winning elections. Meloni in Italy is the exception, but having significant impact on electoral outcomes. And the basis of that argument that I don't want to belabor in my 15 minutes is that the European populist right often wants to go back in time. They want more state, not less. They want to go back to things as they were in post-war, in the post-war period. And that there are a lot of very specific problems, which I'm sure you all know, not the least of which is immigration, but also monetary issues that, and this is debatable, and no comfort to my fellow colleagues who are European, but I've often thought that if some of those problems were somehow adjudicated in some way, the European right would lose some of its steam. And there are others who are coming up with similar arguments. Wolfgang Streeck's new book on the subject, for example. And my contrast point in that article was that the United States was in real danger because our collective political expectations were not as clearly defined as they were in Europe. For example, the welfare state is a big part of European populism, or the lack thereof. And with Trump, we had no idea exactly the extent of and character of popular grievances, but most important, how he would respond on various issues. In other words, there was no predictable path. There was a narrative that developed that he attracted the disaffected, undereducated rural voter, and that became one of the popular narratives. But my argument was we had more institutions in play. As the 2020 election approached, a kind of fascist resistance movement developed among my academic colleagues. And by the time the 2024 election approached, fascism became almost a household word, depending on your household, of course, and it was a big talking point in the 2024 election. in 2020 as well as 2024, and it worked in 2020, not so much in 2024. And at my the last meeting I had here, it was a week after the election. None of us expected Trump to win. And what I talked about was the dangerous, what I call dangerous pulse points. And as I remember, I was a bit of an outlier on this because most people had more hope that the institutions would somehow hold. And at that point, I pointed to three, what I saw as dangers. One, institutions and intellectuals. The plan to redo American institutions, what I'm calling in a new project I'm working on, social authoritarianism. This is the people around Project 2025. These are people who are much smarter than Trump and will remain even after he leaves. And this is the core of the MAGA movement in many ways, or the intellectual core. And they're not the people out in the street with the red hats. Judicial realignment. This is the Supreme Court sort of folding, and the courts folding around Trump, and the empowerment of paramilitary groups. Now, last year I argued that the weakening of the institutional side was more dangerous than the gun toters because they used the law to limit fundamental freedoms. And we have to think of the Supreme Court. And Trump has proven extremely useful to this intellectual brigade, that uses words and laws as weapons. And at that point, and they are dangerous. They are more difficult to pull apart than paramilitary groups. You can put a person in jail for opening fire with an AR-15 rifle. Not so easy to put a person in jail whose main weapon is a thesaurus. We know, I think, for the most part, the people that are this kind of group I'm thinking of the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, the Federalist Society, Conservative Political Action, the National Conservatives. They are all part of this cadre that aims to dismantle the deep state as we know it by picking apart agencies and institutions. These groups have a social dimension. They're deeply fixated on the idea there cannot be any meaningful communities outside of traditional family structures. Masculinity is one of their major cultural tropes. Less of a threat, I thought, were these paramilitary groups who have long resided in the interstices of U.S. non-institutionalized politics. These groups found their leader in Trump. They showed up in Charlottesville. They showed up in January 6th. But in the end, even though they were mobilized, they're so far, and even though we have a serious gun culture, they are so far in the US, they are so far extreme that they're not the people that it's really hard to get the ordinary citizen who is, basically conservative to follow these guys with their guns, etc. And this brings me to the second half of my talk, which is what has taken up all my attention in the past week. And that is the Charlie Kirk murder or assassination, whatever you want to call it. Charlie Kirk was not on my radar screen in any serious way until his murder on September 10th. I don't know how many of you know who he is or had ever followed him or had ever heard of him. He was basically a podcaster with a following as far as I knew. And I tuned in, I became more interested, and then I sat for 4 hours and listened to his memorial service this past Sunday. I live streamed it on Fox. It was a kind of political ethnography, and I have to say that I was completely shocked, and I think it's something new to talk about. I have always argued that most people live in the center, and the margins are where things happen, but it doesn't have to be the extreme margins. And this is where Kirk comes in, I believe. Violence, I think, is ultimately hard to mobilize around, but Jesus is something else. And what I saw in those 4 hours was I'm eventually I'm just digesting a lot of this, but what I saw was a paramilitary of Jesus with the blessings of the state. Not only Trump, but most of his cabinet was there. But that wasn't the thing that shocked me the most. And I know we're going to have a talk on religion, so I feel a little, I think this is more secular than religious, but we can talk about that. And I'm looking forward to Julie Ingersoll's talk. But what I saw, these were the things that shocked me. An incredible level of organization and outreach, a young audience. Of course, it was a white audience for the main part. Enthusiasm. 160 million people in person attended, 90 million in the stadium, and there was 70 million overflow space. 20 million viewers watched it live. And it struck me that this is a missing link. I mean, it's sort of the mobilizing forces, and it's a missing link in our analysis of what's going on in the United States, and where we kind of lose the thread when we simply talk about fascism or authoritarianism. And it is extremely frightening for democracy as we know it. So I can't do a complete analysis here, but I'm going to race through as much as I can here. First of all, I think the media coverage or the essay coverage on Kirk missed the point. He said and stood for terrible things: racism, homophobia, transphobia. He's a misogynist, the list goes on. And it is definitely questionable how one would want to, or that anyone would want to valorize his legacy. This is a legitimate ask. But that Kirk's murder was the end of Kirk as we know it. And the great thing about being dead in this context is that he will never say another thing, meaning he can be anything he wants for MAGA. And he has a power just in sheer numbers and organization that gives him an organizing tool that the left or the standard Democratic Party just lacks. And those of us who care about democracy, which I assume are the people on this panel and beyond, ignore this, I think, at our peril. Why? Again, he was charismatic. He died young. There will be photogenic pictures of him. There was an incredibly powerful narrative of evil at this event. I mean, I was listening for 4 hours to this thing. It's going over and over and over again. They who killed him, but who were they? Nobody knows. I mean, there was this kid who killed him, supposedly pulling the trigger. But there was this incredible narrative of the evil days, a rock concert intensity. And again, I'm just going to go through some of the things that shocked me and that I think are important to think about as we go, as we go to through the rest of this discussion. First, they said this several times, but one of the themes were have more children than you can afford, which I thought was really interesting. Family and community is very important, but the talking about having more children than you can afford, family is not it is your main job. There was a kind of rhetoric of lack of aspiration, which is in some ways very anti-American in our meritocracy. Your family roles are the only ones that matter, but yet in contradiction to the fact that all the mobilization for this is occurring on college campuses. There was a lot of emphasis on dialogue, but it points to something I've been arguing with regard to the left and the Democrats, and that is that solidarity without similarity makes organization and the emotional commitment that you need to commit time to mobilizing very difficult. And this organization has similarity around love of Jesus. We have a paramilitary with crucifixes, not guns. And I also think, and I'd like to hear more about this, that this is more of it struck me as secular, even though there was Jesus talk all the time. So, and a big goal, even though they're talking against having jobs and only being your family, is to get people into organizations and jobs. And in fact, I didn't know this, but Charlie Kirk got a lot of people into the Trump administration, and Trump asked him for who would be good people. So I want to end on that because I just wanted to, I think this is an important part of where we are in the United States now. And we've got to see where this, what this means. But you did ask the question, what is to be done? What is the intellectual responsibility here? And this is something I think about a lot. I think will writing another article help this situation? any rate, I do think a few things that one, I don't think we should be so timid about saying no. And this applies to universities, law schools, et cetera. That's something that can actually be done. The business of dialogue is not so far off the mark. I don't think dialogue should be about conversion, but I think letting people talk is very important. I teach courses on fascism, nationalism. I've been doing it for years, and I end up getting a lot of students who are sort of conservatives. They're not MAGA, but they're Republicans, and they always want to come and talk in my classes. And then they don't proselytize, but they want to talk, and they want to talk to other students. So there's something in that dialogue, if it's not about conversion. But the other thing that I heard in listening to this 4-hour thing, it probably went to 5 in the end, I heard a lot of talk about freedom, 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 but nothing about democracy. And democracy is very, very important, as we know. To call Trump and his minions fascists is not a strategy. But we do know democracy needs to be saved. And if I hadn't sort of had this intervention of this becoming involved in the data, as it were, of the Kirk assassination, what I would have talked about, and I still think this is key, is that education is an advantage as those of us who work in education. And I think it's important, many of the people who've, we say we have to save democracy to as a political rallying cry, don't even have a firm idea what democracy is. It's just something that's supposed to be good, as fascism is supposed to be bad. And I think we really do need to sort of emphasize or go back to some kind of a public understanding of what it means to be democratic. What is very interesting to me, and I'll end on this note, is even as World War II was sort of beginning, there were several organizations that were formed in the United States. There was a National Foundation for Education and American Citizenship. And it seems to me, and there's a whole history around that, but it seems to me that this is where, if we talk about intellectual responsibility, that is one of the ways that we can make a contribution or can shift our analysis. John Dewey in 1916 wrote a book, Democracy and Education. And I think that that's where we have to go back in some way, because this is the only way, it's one channel for saving who we are, who we've been, and where we hopefully will be if we're going to basically, if not stop, at least attenuate the force of these very, at this point, embedded right-wing groups. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. It's a work in progress for both the development of the American fascism and the ways to fight it. Excellent. So the second speaker is Dr. Stephen Friedman from the University of Joburg. Please note Professor Friedman's most recent book that is titled Good Jew, Bad Jew, and he will be telling us about democracy for all, rethinking a failed model. Stephen, you have the floor.
Sorry, I thought you muted me. I thought you were going to unmute me, but you didn't. Okay, so I'm now unmuted, and I can thank you for the opportunity, and say that what I want to do in this 15-minute slot is just very briefly take you through an argument about why we are where we are, and I assume it would be agreed among everybody that where we are is a place in which democracy is under more stress and under more pressure and more in danger than it's been for a very long time. And what I want to argue against, I think that there's a problem about our understanding of this if we imagine that somehow a sort of pristine democratic environment in which democracy was working wonderfully has somehow been subverted by the barbarians. I'm not denying the barbarian bit, but the question is, where does the barbarism come from? And what I want to suggest is that what we are witnessing is the rejection and the collapse of a model of democracy which has been dominant, certainly for the last 30 years or so, and which I think is the cause of the problem. And the model of democracy I'm talking about is this, and I'm talking very much from personal experience because I'm South African, and we became a democracy in 1994, and at the time at which we became a democracy in 1994, I mean, obviously those of us who studied the issue and wrote about the issue were very influenced by the transition to democracy scholarship at the time, which showed how authoritarian societies become democratic. And I think out of that emerged a particular understanding of democracy, which, as I say, has been dominant, but not only among scholars, because we all know that scholars are not quite as influential as we would like to be. I think it has also been dominating the understanding of those who rule or govern democratic societies and those who influence opinion. In other words, the elites. And there are two aspects of this particular understanding of democracy, which I think explain why we are in the trouble that we're in at the moment. The first one is that I've argued in several books and elsewhere that the unspoken but very clear assumption behind this model is that democracy is inherently Western, that the real democracies are in the West, that those of us who are not in the West should be engaged in an attempt to become like the West, and that our democracies should be judged by the extent to which we approximate Western democracies. Now, of course, the problem with this, as some of you may have noticed, is that not all Western democracies are the same, and it's not quite clear what you're supposed to be approximating. But there is a rather idealized version of what North America and Western Europe have been practicing, which those of us in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are supposed to approximate. And I think the best indication of this theory, you know, as I say, there are screeds and screeds of writing which I think support this point. But some of you may or may not be familiar with the notion of democratic consolidation, which admittedly is not as popular now as it was a few years ago. It was an academic cottage industry, but democratic consolidation, in a sense, was supposed to measure whether you became a real democracy or a finished product democracy or not. And I've pointed out repeatedly that one of the seeming oddities about democratic consolidation is that despite the huge influence it exerted on scholars, there is no coherent definition of democratic consolidation anyway. There are a great many incoherent definitions, but there's no coherent definition. So that, you know, if one's not part of the inner circle, it's never quite clear how one would know a consolidated democracy if one found one. But it becomes very clear afterwards that you don't need a definition and you don't need to know what it is that you would look for. Because in a sense, what they're saying is you look in North America and Western Europe, and if you look like that, then you're a consolidated democracy, and if you don't, you aren't. Now, I don't need to point out the biases behind that. At the time this was dominant, some of us argued that this was more an ethnic bias than a political theory, but it has become ludicrous, obviously. I mean, the idea that we should be modeling ourselves on societies where rights and freedoms are disappearing almost as we speak is clearly not tenable. I mean, just if a very brief autobiographical note, I grew up in apartheid South Africa, where we hugely envied people in Western Europe and North America because they had freedom of speech, which we didn't have. Now, we have a situation where I live in South Africa. I can say whatever I like about whatever I like. The chair mentioned, the moderator mentioned my latest book, which is on Zionism and Jewish identity. I was invited by some German colleagues on a webinar like this to discuss the book. And they explained rather embarrassedly that the participation would be somewhat reduced because there were quite a few colleagues who didn't think that they could appear on a webinar like this without risking their jobs. And there were other colleagues who were prepared to sit in the webinar but didn't want to ask any questions or comment because they were worried about losing their jobs, which sort of indicates that the boot really is on the other foot. We used to be, the apartheid state used to impose travel restrictions on us so that we couldn't visit America. Now most of us are afraid to visit America because if we arrive there, we might be arrested at the airport and sent to a detention camp because somebody doesn't like something we said on Facebook. So this idea that we should be modeling on the West is not really tenable. Currently, and I think this really needs to be stressed in discussions of democracy, there is a particular threat to democracy which relates to this Westerness. And that is the question of Palestine. I'm increasingly convinced, and I've been writing about this recently, that if we do not understand the way in which Western societies are responding to Palestine as a democracy problem, then we're missing a very important element of the equation. Of course, a lot of what I'm saying is in the headlines, but just conceptually to underline the point that even in, and this has got nothing to do with authoritarians, populists, etc. What even governments which claim to be staunch advocates of liberal democracy are tearing up democratic principle in order to defend the Israeli state at the moment. So that first of all, if you live in perfectly respectable democracies, you may lose your job if you support Palestine. If you advocate a boycott, which is a very basic democratic right, the right to advise fellow citizens to buy or not buy products, you may well be subject to some kind of punishment. The right to assemble is being eroded. You have a situation in the United Kingdom at the moment where if you hold up a sign in public saying, I'm opposed to genocide, I support Palestine action, you may be arrested. And in fact, many people, hundreds of people are arrested just for doing that. The second point about Palestine and democracy is that the survey evidence is overwhelming. I'm a bit of a skeptical about opinion polls to a certain degree, but if they all say the same thing, then I think you're inclined to believe them. The evidence that in every, certainly I think just about every country on the planet, but in every one of the extant liberal democracies, public support for an end to the genocide in Palestine and a just settlement is overwhelming. The response of those who hold power is to either ignore public opinion or to try to fob it off with token gestures while not actually addressing the problem, so that, of course, the problem persists. Now, as long as democracy is seen as Western, it distorts the development of democracy outside the West. And I think it's one of the reasons why democracy in the West is a problem, not only because of the Palestine issue, but also because, and the response to immigration is a very clear example of what I'm talking about. I think much of what we're seeing is a response by elites to a realization that their societies are changing, that the democracy, which was supposed to be for white people, white European people of white European origin, is now increasingly for people from all sorts of places in the world. And there's so far an inability to adjust to that. So I've limited time. That's the first part of it. Democracy is Western. I think the second part, which is certainly a major reason why democracy is in trouble in the established democracies, is that the kind of democracy we were peddled, in effect, said there is no such thing as private power. And what I mean by this is that in this understanding of democracy, the reason we needed democracy was to manage or to express our relationship to the state. So the threat to human freedom was the state, and the solution was to protect, to ensure A, that the state was responsive to the citizenry, and B, to ensure that the citizenry was not oppressed by the state. All of which is true and all of which is essential to democratic theory. But what that ignores is the fact that private power can be equally oppressive if it's not regulated. And if this sounds terribly radical, it's been brought to my attention over the last couple of days that I keep on being shown quotes when I raise these issues from a man in America, in American history, he's no longer with us, who agreed with me on this issue, whose identity was, his name was Theodore Roosevelt, and he was president in the early years of the 20th century. And there's some very trenchant quotes by Roosevelt saying, you know, if you don't allow government to regulate what he called commercial power, then commercial power will exercise its power over the citizenry. And I think that aspect has been entirely ignored by this model that we've been dealing with for the last 30 years. They never say private power doesn't matter, but they never talk about it either. And if you look at all the writing, and obviously I'm writing a book on this at the moment, I've been going through all of it. If you look at all the writing, there is no discussion about how you regulate private power in a manner which protects democratic freedoms and democratic rights. And you know, if you're talking about forms of states and societies that do, you know, we're not here talking about some radical utopia. We're talking about, in fact, much of the West after World War II operated in precisely this way. The US operated in precisely this way in the 1930s and afterwards. So we're not talking about some grand utopian vision, but that aspect has been totally lost. And I was struck reading a great deal. Obviously, I'm not in the US, I don't live in the US, but we're all fascinated by and horrified by what happened in the US election last year. Just one little factoid or research finding, which I think illustrates what I'm trying to say, is in the last US election, not the presidential election, obviously the congressional elections and the Senate elections that happened at the same time. And there were only a few of them, Democratic Party candidates who promised to do something about price gouging, basically about corporate power, who promised to regulate corporate power, that those Democratic candidates on average did, I think, 8 to 10 percentage points better than those who didn't. And you had some seeming anomalies in a year in which the Republicans were dominating, in which Democrats in some strange places won quite handily, simply by assuring people that they were aware of this issue. I don't have enough time, my time's probably about run out now. I think that if we look at what's happening in democracies around the world at the moment, obviously it is necessary to study the importance of right-wing authoritarianism, where it comes from, etc. But I think that if we look beyond that, we will see that most of the problem lies outside that space. So to take it back to the American example, we tend to not give much attention because there's all this hand-wringing about how all these people voted for Donald Trump last year. And my calculation was that 31% of the American adult population voted for Donald Trump last year. I see that somebody today says 32%. I'm prepared to concede the 1%. We won't argue about that. So that means that, you know, there are 69 or 68% of the population who didn't vote for this particular candidate. And it seems to me that it's in the place where those people reside that we need, you need to look for the problem. There's a sense in which Trump didn't win the election last year, the Democrats lost it. And by that I mean, I think there's a pretty much very robust statistical analysis by people who pointed out that in fact Trump didn't increase his vote, increased it by a bit, but substantially. The real reason he won was that 17 million people who'd voted Democratic in 2020 didn't in 2024. And I think that if we look at the reasons why those people didn't, we get a large part of the story, because you go to a lot of the Western European countries, you will see the same phenomenon, that the problem is not so much the growth of the right, but if you like, among the non-right, people becoming disillusioned, people feeling that your vote doesn't make a difference, because if you don't take on private power, then you don't tackle people's living standards, you don't tackle the issues which people are concerned with day to day, and they reach the conclusion that you're unable to improve their lives. Finally, what is our intellectual responsibility? Well, to me, our intellectual responsibility is obviously to rethink this model and to change the way we think of democracy. And what I've tried to do in my work, it sounds fairly abstract, I suppose, to some people, etc., is to argue this, and that's what I leave you with. That actually we need I agree that we need to say far more about what democracy is and what it isn't. And to me, the starting point of my understanding of democracy, from what everything flows from that, is that democracy is a system in which every adult human being is entitled to an equal say over every decision which affects them. Now, at this stage, somebody's supposed to shoot up their hand and say, in which society has this ever happened? The obvious answer is none. It's not supposed to be descriptive. It's supposed to be a measure. There's perhaps the most important South African political theorist, a man called Richard Turner, who wrote a paper once called The Power of Utopian Thinking. And I think that if we don't have those kind of standards, then we don't know what we're looking for. And I think obviously the democratic freedoms that we value flow from that. You can't have an equal choice in the decisions affecting you if you don't have the right to speak, if you don't have the right to assemble, etc., etc. But it seems to me that if we place this human choice at the center of it, we get rid of this Western bias, because it means every human being has that right. But secondly, we realize that if private power is affecting people's right to choose, then it is as important to regulate it and to ensure that it operates in the public interest as it is to do the same with private power. So I hope I wasn't too much over my time, and thank you for indulging.
Thank you, Stefan Friedman. Thank you for all this thought. We will come back to all these. And let's move quickly to Professor Ingersoll from North Florida University. Her most recent book is named Building God's Kingdom Inside the World of Christian Reconstructionism. Julie, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to screen share if I'm any good at this. Let's see, here we go.
Yeah.
Okay. And sorry, give me a second here. There we go. And okay. So first I want to thank the the European Center for Populism Studies for organizing this event. This is a really important topic. This is my first opportunity to get perspective from around the world. We in the US can be really insulated, even among academics. So this is really interesting to me, and I appreciate being asked to be part of it. So let's see. Okay. I've been a scholar of religion for more than 30 years now. My work is field-based, it's ethnographic. It's built on years of on-the-ground observation and study, and much less on big theories about democracy and how we can address the dangerous rise of populism. I see my role as more participating in the project of gaining a solid understanding of what we're up against, and leaving the theorizing to others, hoping that I've helped them do that well. So when I think about these issues, that's my frame of reference. The first thing I want to talk to you about today is how the various types of Christianity coalesced in the US into what we now call Christian nationalism, and how that connects with other movements that are not considered religious, and I always put that in quotes, blurring the line we think exists between the categories that we call religion and culture or religion and politics. Christian nationalism has at least three divergent components. The first comes from Protestantism, in particular white conservative evangelical Protestantism. And the roots of their character that you see today is in the movement from the 1950s that I wrote about in my book called The Christian Reconstructionists. They believe that the Bible speaks to every area of life and culture. And their vision is built on pro-slavery Southern Presbyterianism. So the idea of social equality is heresy to them. They want to see all of society governed by biblical law. They are theocratic and authoritarian. They reject pluralism as heresy, and they argue that there's no such thing as neutrality. They also introduce this really important view called dominionism, which they trace to the Garden of Eden. God told Adam and Eve to have dominion over the earth, and they believe that modern day Christians are to have dominion over the world and spread their understanding of what it means to be a Christian everywhere. The second of these forms of Christianity is called Catholic integralism. Now, just to be clear, in none of these cases am I talking about Christianity as a whole. I'm not talking about Catholicism as a whole here. This is a minority tradition within the Catholic tradition. But integralism sees Catholicism as the basis for law and policy. They trace their understanding of political order to the divine right of kings. They are also anti-pluralist. They reject the idea there can be neutrality. They reject our notions of the separation of church and state. And they are all about dismantling the administrative state. I used to have the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 also on this slide because their perspective dominates the framework that undergirds that project. But one of the most obvious places where you can see this at work is Leonard Leo and his organization, the Federalist Society, that has transformed the US Supreme Court. That's an image of our current court, in favor of an idea called the unitary executive. This is consolidating power in the presidency against our traditional separation of power and checks and balances. The third version of Christianity that's important in Christian nationalism comes from the charismatic and Pentecostal traditions. These are the versions of Christianity that emphasize the gifts of the Spirit in the New Testament, mostly in the book of Acts. This is the speaking in tongues and the miraculous healing and all of that kind of stuff. The New Apostolic Reformation arose among that group in about the 1990s. They believe that God today calls people to be prophets and apostles, and that means that they are to lead. They wrote their own new form of dominionism called the Seven Mountains Mandate, and they emphasize something called spiritual warfare, in which they literally understand the world as being at war, with apostles and prophets leading God's people over against demons. And they really think that these are literal beings existing in the world around us. And often they think that the demons are their neighbors and the rest of us. So this is the version that is most likely to lend itself to violence. There's a long history of deep division among these groups, though, and it has from time to time erupted in violence. They've all considered the others to be heretics at one time or another, and yet they've made common cause and together become the backbone of the populist movement in the US that we call MAGA. One of the reasons this is possible is that while they disagree on all kinds of theological questions, those disagreements are abstract. They don't necessarily intersect with the day-to-day lives of Christians. We think of religion as being primarily about beliefs, that there are these natural and distinct categories of belief, whether we're referring to Christian denominations or even different world religions. We think people hold to the religious views they do because they studied texts and listened to certain teachers, and that they came to one understanding or another about what they think is true. But I want to suggest that we should consider what might happen if we think of religion as a hodgepodge of contradictory beliefs and practices that people employ as needed to order social interactions, strengthen groups, demarcate insiders and outsiders, legitimize certain social orderings, and construct stories about themselves and their place in the world, and so on. What if religions are giving us distraction over theology over here, but on this other side, they are actually doing the cultural work that matters in the world around us? I think theology is often a distraction from what religion really does. What if theology shifts to the background and the day-to-day details of, in this case, Christian living in the modern world is what really drives behavior? And then there's those divergent, even contradictory forms of Christianity that do interact. Whether it goes by the label dominionism or integralism, these three forms of Christianity share a vision for society in which church and state are integrated under the authority of religion, a theocratic vision. Traditional theological categories slip into the shadows, while dominionism and integralism move to the center, because those things do intersect with the questions about how Christians should live in the world. They share this idea that there is no secular sphere of life that exists apart from religion. They also share other important commitments that aren't necessarily theological in a traditional sense. They challenge modern notions of social equality, and by extension, none are committed to democracy. For evangelicalism, people are ordained by God to their station in life. For the New Apostolic Reformation, God anoints prophets and apostles. Integralist Catholicism is rooted in the historic divine right of kings, a hierarchical power structure given from God. They all agree that the contemporary world is in chaos and decline because it isn't properly ordered according to the dictates of God. And there's something potentially apocalyptic afoot, and that they may have a role in bringing that about, even potentially accelerating its arrival. When we think of religion as a set of beliefs derived from texts that exist somehow in a fixed form outside of history and culture that can be clearly delineated from each other, we mistake what are sometimes useful categories for things that exist in and of themselves in the natural world. In the natural world, there's no obvious division between the people who have different theologies about baptism, for example. People who reject infant baptism think their theology dictates their opinion, when I would suggest that it's the other way around. The way I explain this to my students is this. Imagine you move to a new town and you're looking to find a church. You don't go online to search for a church that has the same view of baptism you do. You find a church where you feel comfortable, where you make friends, a place where you fit, and then what do you know? Within a couple of years, you believe what they believe about baptism. The theology doesn't lead, it follows. One of the reasons we in the US missed the dangerous rise of this populist movement is because we had envisioned components of it as unrelated to each other, these disparate movements that were not powerful in and of themselves, and they were dismissed as fringe and not necessary to be considered. Often the components even hold mutually exclusive views. And those of us who were working in this area, I worked in this for a long time. I have followed Charlie Kirk since more than a decade ago when he put a list of professors' watch list on the internet, and that led to death threats to even some friends of mine. One of the reasons we missed the rise of this movement is because we were being called alarmist. People wouldn't pay attention to the fact that while these groups look different, they look different because of how you're thinking about religion. And if you shift how you think about religion, you can see that they are not that different. On the things that matter, they share a lot. And then there's the Silicon Valley tech utopianism. It goes by various names. And it seems like since it's science-based and technological, it is secular and not religious. I'm getting a message. Okay. So they believe that the American empire is collapsing, and maybe even the human race. They believe in acceleration I'm sorry. I'm getting a pop-up message about somebody wanting to control my computer as I'm speaking, and it's covering my notes. So I apologize. So they believe that democracy is over, and they even embrace accelerationism. They go by names like tech futurism, the dark enlightenment. There's a variety of names. They want to build their networks in the cloud, and then they talk about taking land as nation states fail. They understand they understand the appropriate form of government to be a CEO with a governing board and better elites running things. So again, not at all democratic. In fact, the sorry. No, okay. In fact, the tech-utopianism meshes quite well with Christian nationalism on the things that matter. They reject egalitarianism. They are not committed to democracy. Some even say it's outlived its usefulness. They reject egalitarianism, and they are not committed to democracy. Some even say, some even see society as being on the verge of collapse, but that they can build something better in its wake. They are even open to the idea of pushing along the timeline, and this is called accelerationism. More recently, with the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the discussions about how to understand the complex motivations of the murderer, some of the work I find most interesting and most plausible connects the murderer to online cultures that are enigmatic to observers because they defy a left-right binary, and they're characterized by nihilism. They too reject egalitarianism and democracy. They believe that civilization is about to collapse, and they believe that what will follow will be better, even if what follows is nothingness. And some seek to accelerate that collapse. These groups are all anticipating a societal collapse, and they all embrace accelerationism, meaning they look for ways to further that along in a faster way. But once we're past the accelerated collapse, we're potentially back to the major points of disagreement. Whether there's a variation on the kingdom of God, a tech-based artificial island, a colony on Mars, or a more honest nothingness instead of the pretense that there is meaning when there's not. At that point, they could turn on each other because they don't share a vision for what comes next. Maybe that's an opportunity, but the damage they'll do between now and then is incalculable. Bringing this back around to the discussion of intellectual responsibilities and what we can do, this has never been my strong suit. I take refuge in saying that I stay in my lane, as it were. But I also think that here in the US, I'm still too deep in the weeds to have a good perspective. We have people arguing about how far along the road to authoritarianism we actually are, while there are a lot of others for whom daily life hasn't really changed very much. Moreover, we haven't been here before, and for far too many of us, this was unthinkable. So I do have a hard time getting perspective. But from where I sit, our democracy has already crumbled in many places, far too many places. All eyes are focused on the 2026 election, but the populist movement, this coalition of divergent groups and the people that they have put in power working to undermine the possibility of a free and fair election, they may well have already succeeded beyond correction in the 2026 election. We don't know what will happen to our democracy over the next couple of years. I don't have a plan for saving it, but I think my work would be the same whether I had such a plan or whether we are heading into a long, dark winter. Either way, what I can do best, I think, of value is to continue to help our developing understanding of how we got here, to bear witness, and to document and explain to anyone who'll listen. Here in the US, we're in the midst of a growing and increasingly effective effort to silence dissent. You read about it in the papers as it's happening at big institutions like Harvard and Columbia, but it's happening at small institutions like mine as well. Independent government institutions, major law firms, media, and economic interests have already buckled under pressure. Universities as institutions have been under attack for a while, But now even individual academics are being fired and put on leave, often for things they've said or even have only been accused of saying on social media, not in the classroom. Tenure status has proven ineffective, and even retired faculty have come under attack. These are dangerous times, dangerous and scary. So I think the challenge for academics, intellectuals, is to continue to be willing to speak up. I hope I can. It's the only thing I know how to do. Thank you again for this important conversation.
Professor Ingersoll, thank you very much. Dangerous times, you said. Richard Falk talks about dark times, and he has the floor. But before that, his most recent book, together with Sasha Milanova, is Patriotism to the Earth, a quest for human global governance. We are fully in it. Richard Falk, you have the floor, sir.
You're muted. Sorry, somebody must tell. Oh. No.
I was starting to say that I was very happy to be part of this conversation, and I'm very unhappy to be muted. But I thank the conveners for bringing us together, and think this is a very difficult and timely topic that I approach from more of an international perspective than from those of my countrymen who have spoken as within what's happening within the United States. And in my view, that populism is not so much the my own view is that democracy has been badly tarnished from the role that the United States has tried to play internationally, which had great opportunities to lead the world in positive directions, but failed to meet the challenges and was substantially brainwashed after World War II by the bipartisan ideologies associated with the Cold War, which meant that one had a essentially choiceless democracy on the most important issues confronting the society. And it was reinforced by the role of secrecy in shielding from public awareness some criminal actions undertaken under the auspices of the CIA and others in subverting democratic elections elsewhere, in staging coups against a democratic form of expression that rose to prominence in Chile, for instance, Cuba, Latin America particularly, but all over the world. Even in Iran, the coup that brought the Shah to power also brought theological absolutism as a deferred reaction to that. And in other words, hiding the criminality of government from the public, from the citizenry, and brainwashing them into the idea that this was a part of national security, permanently corrupted the moral sensibilities of the citizenry. See, and that also weakened greatly the role of the two-party system, which never really transcended the limitations of procedural democracy. In other words, for 90+% of the citizenry, democracy essentially involved participating in elections. And if elections don't provide for fundamental choices, it's a disillusioning experience, particularly for those that feel victimized in various ways, whether because they're extremely poor, or they're not white, or not Christian, or that their ideas are not taken seriously. That in this sense, democracy was weakened from within, and in exerting global leadership, the US, as the kind of exemplary democracy, for all its failures, it still served as the exemplary democracy where people wanted to come and to have a better life economically and politically. What it chose when it had the capacity to shape the international order after World War II was to create a design of world order that privileged the winners. The whole design of the United Nations made the 5 most dangerous countries in the world exempt from an obligation to comply with international law or the UN Charter. And that cannot be explained in any plausible way except to create this situation where geopolitics prevailed over respect for law and morality. And we see in the situation that has emerged in relation to both Ukraine and Gaza, the consequences of that law becomes useful for attacking or delegitimizing one's adversary or enemy, and it becomes an obstacle and burden that must be ignored when it is addressed to an ally or a friend. So in other words, law isn't a regulative force. The rule, the US again projected an image that it was the champion of the rule of law. But what it has become is the champion of moral hypocrisy with respect to the application of law. and that destroys its inner integrity, which depends on treating equals equally, not having one law for Russia in Ukraine and another for Israel in relation to the Palestinian struggle. And that has alienated a large part of the world. And the other force, I think, that has undermined any hope for a constructive form of either populism or democracy is a stage of capitalism that is exploitative and basically incompatible with ecological resilience, and has tried to use its private power to influence governments wherever they are, in whatever form they are, to pursue short-term profitability rather than long-term or middle-term sustainability. And this short-termism that is characteristic of democratic government doesn't serve the public good that is confronted with the kind of challenges that have now been suppressed in this populist agenda that tries to govern by belief rather than by reason and evidence. One of the, I think, most destructive features of Trumpism is that it's a war, it amounts to an epistemological war against the legacy of the Enlightenment. It's hostile to experts, it's hostile to truth-telling, it sanctions those unpaid UN representatives who've been trying to tell the public of the world the truth about what's happening in Gaza. Genocide is almost forbidden as a word for reasons that have been articulated by many at this point, but essentially to serve to whitewash this continuing support of Israel in a context of transparent real-time genocide. And when you when there is such a assault on truth-telling by the political leadership, it subverts any kind of responsible citizenship. And so this brings up this question at the end: what does it mean to be a responsible citizen under these general conditions? And it suggests, I mean, putting it nicely, it means taking seriously utopian prospects for transformation. And in a more militant form, it is suggests a kind of revolutionary imperative that the social forces that are now dominant must be replaced by those that serve the global public good and not the private interests of the military-industrial complex or any of the special interests that are deforming public policy. And in that sense, and I will stop at this point, and in that sense, the form of political governance is less important than its orientation toward reality. These fundamental realities of climate change and nuclear weaponry and extreme poverty. And it turns out that if you look around the world, the most responsible, important state is clearly China at this stage, both by the kind of practices and policies and political discourse that it is associated with. And yet it's a highly autocratic governing system that is in every important respect anti-democratic. So we may be in an ecological phase that is almost necessarily post-democratic and post-populist in its organization if the human species is to manage the various crises now confronting us. Let me stop there.
Thank you, sir. Let's move to Professor Diamond, who joined us. And I underlined his not that recent, but interesting book about the spirit of democracy. Its subtitle is Struggle to Build Free Societies Throughout the World. We are fully in it. Larry Diamond, you have the floor, sir.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll speak about the United States, but the global context is very important. I don't think we're anywhere near seeing a cresting of the wave of illiberal or right-wing populism. I'm recently back from a conference of election officials in Latin America, the OAS, and you know, the dominant theme of politics in Latin America now is the surge of right-wing populism modeled on the one hand Trump and on the other hand Bukele. I think this authoritarian, sympathizing and aspirational form of government is likely to reclaim the presidency in Chile, possibly in Bolivia. We're seeing a hard turn to the right in Ecuador. It'll probably return to power in Colombia. It's a very sobering time. And there are very significant demonstration and diffusion effects. Cengiz, you referred to that earlier book of mine, which in some ways, you know, was pondering, I think was an early attempt to call out the signs of the beginning of a global democratic recession, but also traced the global wave of democracy and the return and expansion of democracy during the so-called third wave was very influenced by both diffusion effects from countries that were having democratic transitions and deliberate efforts to diffuse these models, and of democracy, human rights, rule of law, domestically and internationally, and the demonstration effects of seeing something happen and modeling it, modeling movements, tactics, leadership styles, and so on. Back then, we were modeling leadership styles of people like Mario Soares in Portugal and Václav Havel uh, in what was then Czechoslovakia, and now we're the demonstration effects that are having impact are from people like Viktor Orban and your own Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and there are just so many others. Law and Justice has made a resurgence in Poland that now threatens the restoration of democracy there. Other Central European countries are swinging to the right. We face, I think, the very real and frankly terrifying prospect that the national rally, Marine Le Pen's national rally, will take power in France, and that Nigel Farage could become, actually, it's hard to imagine, but I think it is now imaginable, the next prime minister of the United Kingdom. And if this coalition government fails in Germany, I'm not going to predict that alternative for Germany will govern, but it may be impossible to construct a coalition that doesn't involve it or the extreme radical left. And so, we're beginning to see in Germany now the kinds of dynamics of what Sartori and Lintz called polarized pluralism that we saw in the late 1920s and early 30s. It's a very, very deeply, dangerously fluid and polarizing time. And so when you have all this going on, and then you have a clearly authoritarian populist leader in the United States who, after 4 years out of power and with the project behind him of the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, and the more methodical, intellectual, and strategic consideration of how to do in the United States the next time they would come to power. They had 4 years to contemplate this, which would be obviously this past January, how they could pull off what Viktor Orban pulled off, which is a transition from liberal democracy, not just to illiberal democracy, because Hungary is not in illiberal democracy. It's an illiberal non-democracy, but one where Orban, as you know, has been very concerned to, very meticulous about continuing to operate elections so he can claim democratic legitimacy, so he can claim to be the embodiment of the popular will. And the same with Erdogan, and the same with all leaders of electoral authoritarian or similar regimes. So, we have to be very careful in our language. You asked in the title of this session, what are the responsibilities of intellectuals in this process? Well, one is to summon moral and intellectual courage and, to be out there on No King's Day and in a variety of realms of thinking, of organizing. We've seen, I think my American colleagues on this call know, although I don't think there are too many of us, we've seen dramatic resurgence of the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, to try and resist what's happening on campuses. We've seen a surge in funding, organization, support of organizations like Public Citizen, Democracy Forward, Protect Democracy. the Brennan Center for Justice in New York and so on, which are filing lawsuit after lawsuit against Trump's violations of the law and the Constitution. And the courts are, particularly in some regions, the federal appellate level, being very indulgent of Trump's violations and excesses, and the Supreme Court distressingly so. But it's not game over. We've won a lot of cases, and I think where the Supreme Court will land on some of the more egregious violations, it's still not clear. I don't think they're going to uphold his effort, for example, to remove a member of the Federal Reserve Board, Lisa Cook, claiming to have cause, but really having no cause. We're seeing the extreme abuse of the prosecutorial authority. You're seeing that now when he just replaced a federal prosecutor in the Virginia area who declined to prosecute the former FBI director, James Comey, and two others of his declared political enemies. And now he's got this ridiculous amateur, this insurance lawyer who is part of his defense team who's going to try and get an indictment. But this won't hold up in court. James Comey is not going to prison because we still have a justice system in the United States that even if, they can get an indictment, which I'm not sure they'll be able to do, they're not going to convict him in court. But when you go down the list of the autocrat's playbook, and so here I'd refer you to my subsequent book, Ill Winds, where I laid out the steps that people like Orban and Erdogan and Modi in India, and now, frankly, Trump, Bolsonaro, as he tried in Brazil and so on, the steps that they take to try to deconstruct democracy and implement some kind of facade democracy, some kind of electoral authoritarian regime. We are very far along this path now in the United States, and virtually every one of the steps I identified, beginning by the extreme polarization of the political process, demonizing the opposition, not just as wrong-headed, but as evil and immoral, anti the country, and therefore questionable in its right to exist, going after the media as biased and fake news, and now really going after the media and trying to purge it and intimidate it. You've seen what's happened just in the last couple of weeks. We're seeing, as I think you saw in Turkey, we saw in Venezuela in a brutal way, and we see in most of these regimes efforts to take control of the media, not only by the ruling party or the state, but more often by sympathetic businessmen who will become, turn formerly independent media, like the crown jewel of the legacy media, CBS News, into mouthpieces of the regime. We have a shocking, very few people are writing about this intelligently, trend toward concentration of media ownership in the United States. And the dual purchase now by one of the most important mega billionaire families supporting Trump, Larry Ellison and his son, Ellison in purchasing TikTok and his son in purchasing Paramount, the movie studio, which includes CBS and therefore CBS News, is really a warning sign of where we're headed in terms of the decline of independent media and the chilling of dissent and independent reporting. Then you've got the courts and the efforts to purge and stack the courts, the efforts to identify enemy institutions throughout society, to go after law firms, universities, NGOs. I've been waiting because it's so obvious it's going to happen for them to go after philanthropies and civil society organizations. And of course, they're starting by doing exactly what Orban did in Hungary to go after one of the most visible targets, George Soros and the Open Society Foundations and the Ford Foundation, but they won't be the last. So it's lawfare in the most extreme form. You just go down every element of the checklist, politicizing and purging independent institutions of accountability. All of the inspectors general and virtually all of the cabinet departments were fired almost immediately on Trump coming in. This wasn't impulsive. This was part of the plan that they took 4 years to develop in Project 2025 under the brutal theory of the unitary executive. And then in February, in one of the least adequately pondered and covered beginnings of another realm of purge, they fired the JAGs, the Judge Advocates General of the three military services, Army, Navy, and Air Force, because these are the senior advisory figures to the service chiefs of staff who tell them what's legal and constitutional and what's not in terms of military orders. And this has been accompanied, as we've seen in so many descents from democracy into authoritarianism, by purge of the military and security apparatus to plant fierce, ruthless loyalists. Well, as head of the FBI, for example, Kash Patel, the Justice Department, the Department of Defense, which is now, they're not even trying to hide their nature and intent, renamed the Department of War, and what I consider to be a particularly consequential and disgusting development. And we now have to worry about the United States Armed Forces. We've already seen the deployment of the National Guard being used potentially as a political weapon of intimidation in the streets, or even intervening in the electoral process. I know a growing number of people who worry about whether the 2026 midterm elections, not to mention 2028, will be free and fair. And you see what they're doing, following the Erdogan pattern of extreme grotesque gerrymandering to ensure that you hold on to control, even if you don't have a popular majority, which sometimes sometimes Orban in Hungary did not win. I'm speaking about Orban now. But if you gerrymandered the districts and tortured the districting cruelly enough, you can maximize the chances that even if you're not purely rigging the vote, you'll return to power. So this is their project now, to try and essentially give themselves, by squeezing out in unprecedented fashion, midterm redistricting, possibly another 15 seats. And if they're able to get that balance, and we don't pass the proposition in California for the Democrats to counteract that with adding likely 5 Democratic seats in California that would be won, it could prevent the House of Representatives from swinging to the Democrats in 2026, which I still predict it will do. So I think you're all very familiar with the steps on what I call the autocrat's 12-step program on the descent into authoritarianism. Now, let me say a couple more things, and I'll end with the lessons I think I've learned from other cases. I think one of the responsibilities of intellectuals in the face of all this is, frankly, intellectual and terminological rigor. we are in a very dangerous situation in the US, as many countries are, and many democracies are, of democratic backsliding, democratic regression, and the advancing of a clear, obvious authoritarian project, like Orban, like Erdogan, like the BJP in India. These people believe it's their moral and natural right to rule indefinitely, and having won power, then lost it, and now returned, they should never give it up again. And this is very dangerous, but this is not fascism, in my opinion. And it may become someday, and it has varying degrees of fascistic properties in other places. But when you misuse language and concepts, or use them, even if they have a considerable application, very tendentiously and very polarizingly, it's not helpful. I don't think it's helpful to the intellectual debate uh, um, when you overuse terms or kind of throw out, polarizing, morally, weighted language that just kind of pushes away people that we need to bring in. And so we need to be very clear about where we are, what are the elements that kind of resonate with a fascistic attitude, and certainly the stigmatization of minorities, the elevation of the leader. I mean, there are elements here. The United States now today is not an authoritarian regime, but it's a democracy that's rapidly become lower quality, less liberal, less abusive, more rule of law violating, more rights violating, and in danger of becoming a non-democracy. So the lessons that I want to highlight in conclusion about how to address this are, first, I think every case I've seen suggests that you need to mobilize early and vigorously. The sooner you stop this, the better the chance of success. And the longer the project goes on and remakes the state, the deep state, and stacks the bureaucracy, the military, the security apparatus, with its extreme, unquestioning, obeying loyalists, and infuses the business community and the professions with fear and obeisance, the harder it is to turn back. Secondly, I think we need both formal and informal approaches, that is, institutional and outside the formal institutions. And the formal institutions, well, I'm not willing to abandon judicial strategies. I think they still have some promise at drawing boundaries, and Trump hasn't yet violated a clear, obvious, irrevocable, and final Supreme Court ruling. And I think we've seen, even in this Jimmy Kimmel controversy, that there are principled Republicans, very conservative and pretty pro-Trump, that won't go along with that, that there still are boundaries. And if the Democrats can regain control of the House in 2026, they'll be able to stop more legislation, but even more so, take control of congressional committees, have subpoena authority, and be able to begin to formally investigate the absolutely staggering, unprecedented in the history of the United States, corruption of this administration. But you also need civil society mobilization, protests in the streets. These No King's Day protests, I think, have been very significant. 6 to 8 million people came out in the streets in the United States. I think it was in June, and will again, I think, in October for these protests. And you need non-compliance, including from local and state authorities. So that's very important. The third lesson is you've got to win elections. In the end, these people, it's very rare where they're toppled by a broad popular movement, as in Bangladesh and the sudden welling up of student protests. Almost always their downfall and what could be Orban's downfall in the next election, which is why he's moving against his principal opponent now legally, is that even with all of their stacking of the news, the electoral system, and all the rest, they just become so unpopular that they lose and they can't hang on. So mobilizing broad civic and electoral coalitions across class and traditional identity divides is very important. And I think what I've learned from this, and I think this is why Erdogan moved against Mayor Imamoglu, because Imamoglu embodied the strategy I will call out here. I think the general lesson is it's very hard to outpolarize the polarizer in chief. Instead, you have to forge a counter-polarization strategy that brings in a very broad coalition. And I continue to believe that the campaign of radical love in the two municipal elections, I think 1919 and 2024 in Turkey, you know, they have a lot of rhetorical and tactical lessons. And finally, you know, you're not going to win just on the democracy issue. I think that was proven again in 2024 in the US election. People vote first and foremost on economics and on how they're doing. And one of the reasons why I'm hopeful about the US is that these, and elsewhere, is that these people, in the end, they just don't govern well. They're so obsessed with power, and they're so obsessed with, you know, becoming wealthy, and their crony capitalism and their kleptocratic corruption, that eventually people realize that their interests have not been served. So I do think there's still a lot of resonance in the old saw from James Carville, the economy's stupid. And I think that's going to give us a very serious hook or angle for 2026 and 2028. And if you look at the latest public opinion polls from The Economist magazine in collaboration with YouGov, it's not just the economy, where Trump is underwater by 20 points in terms of public approval versus disapproval. He's underwater in every single issue, including crime and immigration, because of the heavy-handed bullying and arrogant way that he's managing all this.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you. I won't abuse my role of chair, so I will open the floor. Please, let's go for we will collect the questions, and there will be a general answer. We have just less than 15 minutes. The floor is yours, and who has, I have seen the few hands of Ragıp Gökçel. Please go ahead, and I will take more questions right after you. Ragıp, you have the floor.
First of all, I want to thank you very much. It was so very interesting.
Please come to the question. We don't have time, Ragıp.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I don't have a question. It was a mistake for me.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
What about the ECPS? I have seen a risen hand there. It was also a mistake. The center raised its hands. Any other questions? Okay, Bülent. Yes, please, Bülent, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Aktar. Thank you very much for these timely and thought-provoking presentations. I have a question for any of the panelists who might wish to elaborate. Actually, Professor Diamond mentioned a bit, but I wonder more. How do you assess Donald Trump's overt and covert attempts to draw the military into American politics? For instance, he ordered a military parade on 4th of July, his birthday, and also US Independence Day. And later as Professor Diamond mentioned, he mobilized the National Guard in several major cities, including Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. Do you see these actions as posing a risk of militarizing of American politics or even politicizing the US military itself? And what might their impact be on on other ailing democracies? Thank you very much.
Okay, Bülent, thank you, Bülent. Any other questions, please? Otherwise, we'll go right to the answer by Larry and others, by the way. Any
Okay,
other
well, I'll
questions?
be very brief in answering.
Okay. Yes.
It's serious, it's intentional, it's very, very dangerous. It has both direct and symbolic implications. Like all of these people, they want to rally nationalism and a very ugly, chauvinistic, exclusivist form of nationalism. And so the anti-immigrant element goes along with that. And celebrating the military and blowing boats out of the water and claiming, while violating international law, that they're all powerful and protecting the country. This is all part of a common package. But the practical implications, I think, are even more disturbing because I do think they're violating the law and the Constitution in the way they're doing this and in their motive for doing it. And there are people who worry that he could seek actually to deploy the National Guard or the U.S. military to particular states or congressional districts in 2026 if the congressional election is close, to seize control of the ballot boxes and take command of the recount. I don't know if the courts would let him get away with that, but the speculation about this is not coming from intellectuals or university professors who are detached from knowledge of this. This fear was expressed to me by a very senior retired military officer fairly recently. So it's very dangerous. He is trying to create a United States Armed Forces, he's been very blunt about it, that is personally loyal to him and the MAGA movement. And that's a very big step on the path of authoritarian descent.
Okay, Julie, you have a
Yeah, I'd
question?
like to jump in there. I have less to say about how, the military in general, and you may or may not be aware of this, but Pete Hegseth is tied very deeply to the Christian Reconstructionists that I write about, the 21st century version of it, which is associated with an empire built in Moscow, Idaho. I have a piece about him at the Conversation that I wrote just before his hearings, because I was trying to argue that we have all of these impediments to talking about religion in public, and so nobody would ask him about these things. But yeah, he's a problem. So anyway.
I have a question from Walter Horn I think to you again, Larry. He mentions Armitage on Substract, who has said that there are almost no examples in history of authoritarian governments being deposed by democratic means. Is that assessment affected by your view that the US is not actually an authoritarian regime at present, or is Armitage just mistaken? shortly.
So the most clearest example of pulling back from an authoritarian path in Central and Eastern Europe is Poland. But, you know, you see what happened, the tragedy of this recent presidential election. And I'm sure you've seen, you know, some of the great writing I have seen, the agonized writing about, let's say, that the Civic Coalition had won the presidential election in Poland and had unified control of the prime ministership and the presidency. They still face all these landmines that were planted in the constitution and the state structure by Poland. And then comes the debate: to what extent do you use some means that may not be purely in line with the law and the Constitution as it was deformed by the authoritarian-minded predecessors to restore democracy. And I think this is going to be an agonizing problem as we experience, which I think we will, alternations back from these authoritarian projects, because they're not, I simply don't accept that they're there indefinitely. At some point, their failures, their corruption, their immoral character, leadership change, the death of people like Erdogan, it will bring change. Eventually, there will be new democratic moments. And I'll just say again, the minimum condition for some kind of democracy, however illiberal, is that people can choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections with a relatively level playing field and integrity in the voting and vote counting. We still have that in the United States. There's no evidence that we don't have it, although this midterm redistricting and some of the other things they'll try to do to, you know, intimidate minority voters and so on are nibbling at the edges of that. So the biggest test is going to come in the midterm elections in 2026.
Okay, Larry. I mean, I think there is no more questions. At least, anyhow, we have 5 minutes left. How to summarize such a rich debate, frankly, and almost impossible. But I have taken several notes. I can write a new piece about that. I'm working on the Turkish authoritarianism and totalitarianism. But I mean, we are certainly, I mean, the zeitgeist, as we used to say, it has shifted dramatically. And we are not talking about how to build democracies, but we are talking about how to save democracy and how to not fall in another abyss, like in the dark times, as Richard Falk
Right.
put it again. So I think it's important that critical and vital to properly define the problem one is supposed to combat. I mean, in other words, calling a fascism is fundamental and it doesn't bear euphemisms. I mean, anyhow, I mean, the times are dark, extremely difficult, and there are few lights here and there, like Poland electing again, a democratic government, and then, electing, a non-democratic president. Latin America was mentioned. They are looking in fear to the north, and the entire world is I mean, is in not in trouble, is more than in trouble. I mean, it's as I said, it's zeitgeist, and we are not talking about, even populism is not sufficient to define this, because as I said in the very beginning, I mean, these people, whether we like it or not, in many countries have mass support. And I took note of an important point made by Mabel Berezin, and she mentioned freedom versus democracy. I think we are fully in it, and the libertarian understanding of the freedom of speech, but also for those who are not who are against democracy. I mean, they have to talk, they can talk, and they're talking, by the way, and with using the tech brothers and the social media. I mean, the cocktail is absolutely worrisome. I mean, but of course, freedom of speech, but until a limit, because as Stephen put it, there is no freedom of speech for those who are who are talking about the Gaza genocide, for instance. There's no that's the limit of the freedom of speech. So I think all in all, we are again, I mean, in very dark times, and I'm afraid the ECPS will have to gather more conferences of the kind in the weeks and months to come. Thank you all. It's 5:58. I give the floor to Selçuk to make the official or Bülent for the official closing.
I thank you all. I think the presentations were fascinating, and I again hope we can keep in touch. All the best.